Hello, in this video we're going to be looking at the basics of ecocriticism. Um, we'll be taking a closer look at ecocriticism in more detail in a future video where I'll be talking about Val Plumwood and some of her specific ideas about ecocriticism. This talk is going to be mostly based on Lois Tyson's chapter in Critical Theory Today that deals with ecocriticism. I'm going to be giving you an overview of it. Simply said, ecocriticism is a way to read literature that shows a relationship between humans and nature. That's simply put. One of the big ideas that we can think about when we're trying to read literature and make sense of it with humans and nature is thinking about the idea that we are currently living in the Anthropocene epoch. Anthropocene or Anthropocene, whichever pronunciation you prefer. It's the idea that humans have made such a huge impact on the environment that our geological epoch itself right now is named after us. This isn't quite scientific. So scientifically speaking, we're living in the Holocene, which means the new era, right? And the Pleistocene was one that came before this, etc. There is an association called the International Union of Geological Sciences, I think, that determines what the names of our periods are, our epochs, and they're still sticking with the Holocene, although they have, from what I understand, met and discussed the possibility of the fact that we could be moving into the Anthropocene. That's yet to be determined. But regardless of the scientific terminology, it's very useful to be thinking about the Anthropocene as an era that we're living in that we need to deal with. The reason is that it shows that human beings have realized that our situation with the environment is so dire that we need more than just more technology to get us out of it. We need to generate an entire new way of thinking about the world. And realizing that we are living in a new epoch it's a good sort of foundation for creating that thinking. Lois Tyson in this chapter discusses three approaches to ecocriticism. One is deep ecology, one is eco-Marxism, and one is ecofeminism. So there are a lot of different ways that we can look at ecocriticism. I'm just going to give you an overview of these three basic approaches. So deep ecology is something that's being perpetuated by somebody named Arne Ness. And he lists a bunch of principles that we can live by in order to find more of a harmony with nature. So finding harmony with nature is one of the big ideas in deep ecology. Deep ecology is something that has been criticized, and it has some good, useful ideas for reading literature, and also has some ideas that are under a lot of scrutiny. And I'm just going to talk about the good and the bad of it. I want to just look straight at the book here and explain what some of these steps are. So one of the principles is to understand the inherent value of nature. So rather than putting like a price tag on it, think about living and non-living things as having value for just simply for themselves. So that's a very basic and I think a pretty nice and useful step to take, right? There's the idea of biodiversity. This is his second point. That the environment and the idea of global warming, climate change is threatening us. But what's threatening us just as much is a loss of biodiversity. So when animals and plants begin to go extinct, that's detrimental to us too. His third point is the idea of vital needs. So we have the resources in nature to take care of what we really need, our vital needs. But if we start to abuse that and start to take more resources than we need, then that's bad. That's detrimental, and it's bad not just for the environment, but for us. His fourth point is the idea of human population. And this is one that comes under a lot of scrutiny, especially now. The idea that we have to substantially decrease human population because human population is the main thing that's destroying the environment. This one has, I have heard people refer to this one as eco-fascism simply because it's blaming people, and it's something that would essentially possibly start to wipe out some of the most vulnerable people in the world. That's not the intention of it here, obviously, and what would actually happen is unknown. But uh, people nowadays tend to, I think, look toward the distribution of resources rather than simply the idea that too many people are using them. Because when you start to think in this direction, the weakest people or the most vulnerable people often are more at risk. Um, so that, take that one as you will. That's my own critique and just critiques that I've heard. The fifth point is this idea of human interference, that we need to stop being so obsessed with interfering with the environment. This one's very general to me. Number six is policy change. So the idea that we need to change large scale policies in the world, and a critique of those in power who keep the policies what they are, is what that one's about. Um, Quality of life is an interesting one. He basically says that our enjoyment in life should come from doing things like breathing clean air and realizing that we're in a beautiful place. And that's where quality of life should come from rather than having material possessions. And then there's a number eight, which is kind of strange. He talks about obligation, and he puts the obligation for this only on people who endorse the principles of deep ecology. He says people who don't believe in these principles or who don't know about them aren't going to be held to this method, which I think kind of undercuts the whole thing and makes it really weak. So it's realistic. It's an interesting approach, and I think all of those things that I just mentioned, you should be able to use any of those ideas to do a reading of literature. So remember, the idea here is not that you need to adopt all these things as your beliefs. The idea here is that you can take some sort of principle and use it as a lens to read literature. And that's my intention in showing this to you also. Um, the idea of having to reduce the human population is something that I take issue with, and also Lois Tyson in this book personally endorses pretty strongly the idea that the biggest thing we need to do is reduce human population. Now, if I were going to do a reading, if I was going to do a reading on something, I might think about taking that idea and using that lens so that I can disagree with that lens while I'm doing a reading. So the nice thing about not agreeing with everything or not liking everything in a particular theory is that you don't have to adopt that theory as your opinion. You can adopt that theory as your anti-opinion and do a reading that way. Wouldn't that be interesting? I've done things like that before, and it's a challenge, and that's one of those things that makes this stuff worthwhile and brings out new knowledge into the world. So that was deep ecology. Another aspect of eco-criticism, an approach, could be eco-Marxism. So eco-Marxism just takes the ideas of Marxism and it adapts them to show how these anti-capitalist ideas of Marxism could help the environment. And I'll just I'll give you an idea of the book here that you'll be reading yourself. Um, so in eco-Marxism, there are also some sort of principles, and that is that capitalism. So in Marxism, capitalism is a destructive force. It sort of reduces everything down to profit and competition and supply and demand and infinite economic growth, right? So those things are damaging to people, to our social world, but also it's going to be adapted here. It's also damaging to the natural world. So the idea of competition, here's a key word here, competition, that finances are always the prize, right? So everything you do ends up being competition to make the most money. That's detrimental to the environment. Rugged individualism is another point here. That part of this is you want to be the toughest person and be able to beat everybody out. And you can imagine trying to get rid of your rivals and things rather than working together. You can imagine how that would be detrimental to the environment. Consumerism. So, a big principle of capitalism is consumerism. You need to get everybody to want the stuff that you're making. Obviously, that's an obvious one, right? Bad for the environment. And commodification. So every single thing is reduced to what kind of financial value it can have. Everything's a commodity, including national parks, including anything within nature. Somebody's going to want to own that and exploit it, right? So this is just some ideas that you can work with if you're interested in Marxism and you want to do an ecological reading that has to do with Marxism. Um, Another aspect of this is the third one out of three that she was discussing, is ecofeminism. And this ecofeminism, I think, is really, it makes a lot of sense. It's easy to work with. And I think, especially for the reading that I'm asking you to do, I'm asking you to do the yellow wallpaper. This particular story is kind of a renowned feminist story. It has feminist aspects to it. So I think ecofeminism, if you're trying to do, an eco-critical reading of this, could make a lot of sense. Now, I invite you to take on the challenge of doing other readings too, including some of the ideas that I'll talk about in the next video that center around Val Plumwood, which is more difficult than this stuff, but I think pays off maybe some more. But let me just discuss ecofeminism, and you can kind of put a little bookmark in this one and say this might be a real easy one to do if you're doing a reading of the yellow wallpaper. So feminism, regular feminism, deals with how patriarchal culture views men as strong, smart, dominant, and it views women as people who need to be sort of possessed and controlled. Now, I discussed feminist criticism more in depth in another video, so I'll just leave it at that for this. You get it, right? So ecofeminism uses the same principles, but just like with eco-Marxism, it takes the principles of feminism and puts them into an ecological reading. And it works really well, actually. So ecofeminism points out that an anthropocentric culture, so in other words, a culture that's centered on humans, treats nature as something to be possessed and controlled, just like a patriarchal culture treats women as something to be possessed and controlled. So we have this this sort of like female coding of nature and a male coding of humans. We can look at what we call dichotomous pairs to understand some of these principles. So a dichotomous pair is a pair of two things that are sort of presented as dualistically opposite, but they're hierarchized. So you create a hierarchy by taking two terms and putting one above the other in importance and strength. So we can talk about man and woman. As a dichotomous pair, our culture is going to put man above woman. Man is strong and in charge, a woman is weak and needs to be controlled. Not my opinion. That's the hierarchy that that a patriarchal world will create. So if we're laying this on to an eco-critical reading, then an analogous pair would be human and nature. So instead of man, woman, we look at human and nature. So human is in control, has agency. Nature has no agency and needs to be controlled. The hierarchy puts humans above nature. So in one facet of ecofeminism, they'll look at dichotomous pairs like that and they'll simply switch the order. So you can take nature and human, right? And you can put nature above human and talk about the why nature is the strong entity that is controlling, and put human underneath it as the weak entity that's being controlled. And I think it's pretty easy for you to picture a bunch of scenarios that could be used to support that. Now it's fun, it's interesting, but it's also a little bit problematic because feminism, regular feminism, seeks to stop dichotomizing things like this. Regular feminism wants to take the idea, the patriarchal idea that men are above women, and take the man-woman dichotomy and use them as a comparison or as complementary to each other, rather as dichotomized, opposite, and hierarchized. So in a way, when you just flip the hierarchy, you're still feeding into this patriarchal idea. You're just sort of rebelling against it. So it's controversial even within feminism, even within ecofeminism, but it's a way that we can get ourselves thinking and learning new things about texts. So I think it could be useful. Um, Another aspect of ecofeminism points out that the worst parts of capitalism are such as consumerism and competition and commodification are analogous to a human-centric view of nature. Lots of different possibilities there, I'm sure, but nature as a commodity, consumers wanting to somehow consume nature rather than coexisting at the same time or being part of it, right? And then finally, there's this thing called post-colonial eco-criticism. So this idea that in post-colonialism, it discusses how colonization of other people's lands causes cultural damage, it causes loss of life, it causes oppressive ideologies, it causes horrible things to happen like enslavement, things like that, right? Um, the ideologies in that situation elevate the colonizer and they diminish or humiliate or even erase the colonized. So a post-colonial eco-criticism reading would examine this with a particular emphasis on the land, on natural resources, on types of racism and prejudice that would prevent the distribution of resources, things like that. So those are all just like different possibilities within an eco-critical lens. You can take any of those you want to use. How are you going to take any of those though and apply it to a reading of literature? So there's some ideas here that I'd like to share with you. An eco-critical reading is going to look at how nature operates. So how are humans and nature operating? So in order to accomplish this, a big question that I think you can ask in just about any eco-critical reading, no matter how you're using eco-criticism, is nature portrayed merely as part of the setting, or is it used symbolically, or is it used as like a metaphor or something to further the story of people? Or is nature present for its own sake? So when you're reading something, are you supposed to be thinking that, this waterfall represents the feelings of this person? Are you supposed to be realizing that, like, when night falls and you're in a mountainous situation, that means that, like, it's sort of a symbol for the trouble that somebody's in? Or are there descriptions of natural settings and geological features and things that are maybe not even necessarily beautiful, but just features of our world, and they're there because they are just part of the story. We're supposed to be noticing them. Asking that question will get you to the answer: is this anthropocentric, or is this nature for nature's sake? And through an ecological lens, whichever answer you come up with, you have come up with that answer with an ecological lens. So the book has some examples. There's a comparison between William Wordsworth and John Clare and poems that they've written, and surprisingly, the lens shows that William Wordsworth was actually using nature in an anthropocentric way, in a human-centered way, even though he's known as a nature poet, and that John Clare was actually showing nature more for its own sake. So an eco-critical reading does not have to be a reading that shows you that this is nature for nature's sake in this reading. If your conclusion is that this is an anthropocentric story that is not using nature for its own sake, that's only using nature to portray humanity, that's still a good reading because you've used the lens to come to that conclusion. It reveals something about the reading. And that's actually illustrated in this chapter. At the end of the chapter, Lois Tyson always does a reading of the same book, of The Great Gatsby. And she does an eco-critical reading of The Great Gatsby, and that's not the kind of reading that you would understand, that you would normally expect, right? Because it's not really a story about nature. So what she kind of concludes here is that there's really not nature in this in this book that's portrayed for nature's sake, there's a lot of mechanized and industrial imagery, and the lack of natural elements in this story, the absence of natural elements in this story, has a lot to do with what Gatsby is wanting us to think about mechanization and technology. So even if there's not a lot of nature in it in a story at all, you can still figure out how to read it with an eco-critical lens. I also want to point out that this chapter, toward the end, there's a heading here that says some questions eco-critics ask about literary text, and there are 6 questions here that are pretty in-depth that could be really useful for you if you're trying to figure out how to do an eco-critical reading. You're going to be reading The Yellow Wallpaper, which isn't a story that has a ton of nature in it, but nature is present in this story. And there's also an indoors and outdoors, and there's human nature, all kinds of stuff, right? So the natural world is present. And if you read this story with an eco-critical lens, what are you going to be able to discover about the story? What are you going to be able to uncover that other people haven't necessarily talked about before? So don't limit yourself to thinking of nature as like forests and fields and waterfalls and mountains. You can be thinking about nature as inside and outside. You can be thinking about nature as both objects and behaviors. Nature sometimes is expressed through what it isn't. So if there's something that's very quintessentially not natural, that has something to do with nature, right? And an eco-critical lens could bring that out. So be creative with this, meet the challenge. Also watch the next one where I go even further into eco-criticism if you like. And good luck. I'll see you in the next one.